Hi, everyone. I hope everybody's ready for another evening of learning. So tonight we are joined with a person who will be talking about how human impacts, how humanity or human beings interact with and impacts the world around us, and probably and most likely specifically on our the Philippine Coral Reefs. He'll also be talking about the current status of the reefs, which have been of late a topic that has gained so much attention, especially in our midst, in our discussion. So tonight, let's sit back and listen and learn, of course. There will be a time for questions, and please be mindful of the house rules. They have been flashed on your screens while waiting for the event. I would just like to emphasize that your questions will be entertained, especially if they are in the Q&A box and on Facebook Live. So we are also streaming live on Facebook. For those who wish to participate in the event there, the stream is on the page of the Learning Series event. So this is Learning Series event 8.0. Tonight we are joined by our speaker. Dr. Wilfredo Licuanan, or Dr. Al, as he is fondly called, is a full professor of the biology department and university fellow of the Salle University. He was also the founding director of the Brother Alfred Shields Ocean Research Center, or SHORE, and he has been serving and monitoring coral reefs for over 25 years. He has led research teams to many previously unstudied reefs from all over and around the country, including the Kalayaan or Spratly Islands, where he discovered a coral species that is new to science. And he has done so also in the Pacific Ocean coasts from Luzon to Mindanao. Tonight's learning event series is brought to you by the Dumaguete City Host Lions Club and the Rotary Club of Dumaguete South. And in behalf of these organizations, we would like to welcome Dr. Al.
Okay, thank you, Angie. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the things we study and care deeply about. So, the presentation tonight is fairly straightforward. I'll talk about corals and the coral reefs that they build. I will then talk about coral reefs and the quality of human life, and tell you about the status of our reefs, the result of our recent work that allowed us to undertake a nationwide reassessment of reefs from 2014 to 2017. So I show you images of corals, of our corals. Very, very interesting, very beautiful animals, although most of the time they just sit there underwater. Corals are animals, and they deposit a skeleton, and essentially they sit on their skeleton. So they're not really inside their bodies. They're also unique because they have plants living inside their tissues, microscopic algae, and these algae provide up to 80% of the coral's energy needs. So the corals, these animals, also need sunlight for the algae that live inside them. And thus, they like to grow in places where there is sunlight and the waters are clear to allow the sunlight to pass through. To demonstrate that these are indeed animals, I show you video of them reproducing, the closest they get to having sex. So this is an adult video if you're a coral. For this coral, the male and the female are found in separate colonies. And you can see the male is releasing so much sperm that it looks like it's smoking hot. Okay. And the female is releasing a lot of eggs. So for many corals, fertilization is external. It happens in the water column. This produces the larvae that get carried with the currents. So corals are animals with plants living inside their bodies. So we have lots and lots of corals. The Philippines, after all, is a center of diversity. That means we have lots of species found nowhere else. Some corals form small colonies the size of plates, grow rather fast. Fast here is about a centimeter a month. Some get to be really big, like this coral here on the side. It grows really slowly, but in this particular case, it's 4 meters wide. And if you do the math, you will realize that this is a really, really old coral. And these types of corals are believed to be able to live forever like elves. And like elves, they can live forever. But if something happens, that something could still kill them. And so when you have aggregations of corals growing in one place, covering the surface, that's the mark of a really healthy reef. Lots and lots of coral covering the surface. You have the components of what could be a coral reef. To understand what a coral reef is, let's look at some fossils. On the screen now are fossil corals. This one is like the coral in an earlier slide. This is also about 3 meters across. It's now dead, of course, because it's already outside water. But when it was alive, the water level was about 3 meters higher. And this coral was submerged and alive. If you look at the adjacent cliffside, you will see layers and layers of corals, table corals, staghorn corals, submassive corals at the base. It's a fossil reef about 6,000 years old that formed when much of this area, Punta Dumalag in Davao City, was underwater. Here's another set of fossils, this time in the far north. The town is Curimao. You can see lots of branching corals forming a thick layer. And you have my foot there for scale on the side. And this really elegant, large colony of a staghorn coral fossilized in place in its natural form. Okay, so this is what fossil reefs look like, and we have lots of fossil reefs. We just don't realize we're walking all over them. This is that fossil reef where those pictures were taken. The reef is also now dead because it's now outside water. But when this was growing about 10,000 years ago, sea level was also higher because the planet was also warmer then. And the oldest corals at the base of this fossil reef is about 10,000 years old. The youngest near the top is about 6,000 years old. And so if you go through that those layers, you can determine their ages, you can determine how fast the reef grows. And this fossil reef, based on the dates of how old the corals are, grew at about a meter per 100 years. Okay, so a reef grows very slowly, even though this is the fastest in the Indo-Pacific. That's still a meter in 100 years. It's a meter, but you're talking about a reef that could be several kilometers long. And let me show you how large a reef is. So what I talk about in this diagram is a cross-section of an island. Initially, a young island would just have corals growing on rock. But as the generations of corals that live in that place leave their skeleton behind and gets overgrown by other corals, they start forming a thick layer and begin to form a platform that is shallow at the top and then has a distinct slope. And that's when you get a fully formed or well-developed reef. And well-developed reefs could be several thousand years old and could be several kilometers wide. And we have such reefs in parts of the country. Here's one, a town in the northern end of Mindoro Island. And this photo was taken with a camera mounted on a kite that's being pulled behind a banca or pump boat, which you can see here along with the line or tether that connects to the kite and camera. So you can see that the reef here is pretty large. And if you look closely, you will notice that there's actually 3 reefs stacked on top of each other. This is the oldest reef. And when this formed, the island kind of sank a few meters, which meant less light got to the corals here. And so they tried to grow vertically, formed a second layer, and then the island sank again. And so a third layer had to form. And so if you make a dive here, you will notice the reef has a profile that looks like steps because the reef was trying to keep up with the surface where there is sunlight. So reefs are found all over the tropics. This diagram tries to illustrate the different reef systems found around the world. Most famous, of course, is the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, a system of about 1,200 individual reefs. But more important than the Great Barrier Reef is the so-called Coral Triangle, this cluster of nations with the Philippines at its northern apex. This cluster holds half of the coral reefs of the world. This is the coral triangle again in close-up. And in red, the red dots are the coral reefs in the area. And this is a map of the reefs of the Philippines. I'll show you later, the Philippines is number 3 globally in terms of reef area, an estimated 13 to 25,000 square kilometers of reefs. And yes, you have reefs in front of Dumaguete. And we'll get to that later. So in terms of reef area, you have Australia and Indonesia as number 1 and number 2. There's a newer study that suggests Indonesia has slightly more reef area than Australia, but clearly the number 3 country in terms of reef area is ours, the Philippines, with 9% of the reefs of the world in our waters. So, my first reminder, reefs are really old. Takes a long time for them to form. A lot of corals to do so. Just because you have coral doesn't mean you're looking at a coral reef. But if you have a coral reef, that means you've had thousands of years of growth of millions and millions of coral. That's what a coral reef is. And why should we care about our coral reefs? Well, for one, reefs are very important for food security in the country. An estimated 25% of our fisheries production is dependent on our coral reefs. Why? The reefs are feeding grounds, the reefs are nursery grounds, even of deep sea fishes like this. In this video from Tubataha, in the middle of the Sulu Sea, our largest marine protected area and best managed marine protected area. There's so much fish that they cast a shadow over the reef. So reefs are very important for food supply, food security. Coral reefs also are habitats for many other organisms, not just fish. So in this map showing in shades of various colors the number of species of fishes, crustaceans, mollusks, snails and clams, corals, seagrasses, mangroves. You'll see that reef areas in light blue have less than 100 species, but areas in dark red have over 3,000. And look closely and you will see why the Philippines is called the center of marine biodiversity, particularly in its shallow coastal waters, where most of our reefs are found. And these species are not just for bragging. Okay, many of them are really important, like have chemicals inside their bodies with medicinal properties. A good example is this snail, which if it manages to sting you, can make you drop dead in a matter of minutes. Notice what it eats. Okay, imagine this slow-moving snail. Its diet consists of fishes. How Does a slow crawling snail capture fish for dinner? Well, uh, they produce simple protein, which has very toxic properties for the fish. But if harnessed properly, they have applications in medicine. And this is, for example, one example is the work of one of our national scientists, Dr. Lourdes Cruz, and demonstrating the potential of marine organisms for medicine. Another reason we should care about the reefs is because a healthy reef produces 1 to 5 kilograms of white sand per square meter per year. Okay. Because white sand is just ground up skeleton of coral. Calcium carbonate, same material that makes up our bones. You grind up the coral skeleton and you get white sand. And so what I said earlier about reefs growing, it's because their skeleton makes up the sediments that constitute that reef that gave you that white sand. And the ability of the reefs to grow is important in terms of protecting our coastlines from waves. This is the work of Cesar Villanoy in UP, and they showed that the reefs are able to reduce the height of waves hitting the coastlines. And if the reef is allowed to stay healthy, that reef can even keep up with sea level rise and continue that shoreline protection factor or function. And why is that important? Well, as you know, our country is hit by around 20 typhoons a year. Remember Yolanda or Haiyan generated storm surges, essentially obliterated Tacloban, killed thousands. And if you had healthy reefs in the area, they could have been valuable in reducing the strength of waves, especially if the reef is backed up by a mangrove. So coral reefs and mangroves are important buffers for storm surges because the reefs get a lot of attention, but we should not overlook that the reefs are just a vital component of an ecosystem. A healthy one would also have lots of mangroves, lots of seagrass, and even beds of seaweed or kelp. So reefs are really important, very valuable for a number of reasons. So I come to the last part of the presentation where I talk about how the reefs in the country are doing. The results of the surveys we undertook for 3 years, ending in 2017. We visited over 400 reefs around the country, undertook surveys in 206 of them, and this is what we found. The first nationwide assessment of reefs was done by our national scientists, Doctors Alcala and Gomez. And in their surveys 40 years ago, they defined these categories, and the healthiest reefs were termed excellent, and excellent reefs have more than 3/4 of their surface covered by coral. In our latest surveys, we did not find a single reef that could be classified as excellent. So 40 years ago, 5% of our reefs were in excellent shape. Now, none are in excellent shape. So if you look at how much coral is covering their surface, up to 2010, the estimates were suggesting the average coral cover was around 33-32%. Our surveys showed the average cover now is more like 23%, suggesting we lost about a third of our coral cover in the last 10 years, which is really bad news. But you also have to remember that even if coral cover in a reef is just 10%, that reef is still able to grow. That reef is still able to keep up with changes in sea level. That reef can still take care of itself. So most of our surveys, this is what we found. The waters are silty. There's hardly any fish. There's a lot less coral. Most of the corals are dead. And the algae, the variety that's not edible, is taking the coral's place. So the results are summarized in these two charts that show how much coral is in a survey station and how much variety of corals are in each. And if you see a red symbol, that just means the amount of coral or the diversity of corals is below average. So our reefs are not doing so well. But there are still gems out there. This photo was taken in the summer of 2019. And you can't help to feel giddy when you see reefs like this. Unfortunately, the best ones are really in remote places, mainly because we overlook the gems that are a few meters from our shorelines. So, just to summarize that part, we have lost a lot of coral in the last decade. Things are not hopeless yet, but we cannot be complacent any longer. One reason we cannot be complacent is because the challenges are still out there. This is a temperature anomaly chart, an animation showing areas in yellow to orange to red, indicating the sea surface temperature is above normal. Above normal temperatures, like what happened last year, one of the warmest years on record, stresses the corals and disrupts this symbiosis between the plants living inside the coral's tissues and the coral itself, the host. And when the corals lose the plants inside their bodies, they bleach, they turn white, because you see through their tissues into their white skeleton. that means the coral is beginning to starve and could be dead in a matter of weeks. And bleaching, unfortunately, is happening more frequently now. This is what bleaching did to a reef in Palawan. And in a matter of about 3 weeks, killed all the corals on top of this reef. As far as the eye can see, all the corals are dead. Something that is so noticeable that there's actually a passage in the Papal Encyclical on the Environment, which states that who turned the wonder world of the seas into underwater cemeteries bereft of color and life. And that was talking about coral bleaching and the death of reefs like this because of climate change. On top of climate change, we have what we call development, okay, which inevitably damages the land, the vegetation that covers the land, the drainage systems, if there are, and brings a lot of sediment to the sea. The so-called development, even in areas several kilometers from a reef, will eventually get to the sea and choke the reefs in layers of sediment so thick that you can hardly see beyond your hands, and kills all the life in that reef. Which brings us to the people that depend on these reefs. As you know, the poorest sector of Philippine society are fishers, not farmers, but fishers. And the poorest of the fishers don't even have boats. And a fisher like that, no boat, can only spearfish during low tide on the reef. This is what one fisher gets in a whole night's work. And this has to feed a family of 5 or 6 for an entire day. In contrast, a fisher who's not doing too badly has a boat that can go 5 to 10 kilometers offshore. And these photos were taken on the same day. Catches 9, 10 times more, and catches the kind of fish that is high value. Tanige. So, as the reef falls apart and dies, it leads to a situation where the poor fishers, the poorer of the fishers, become poorer, and the poor fishers become desperate, resort to the most efficient fishing gear available to them, even if that involves blasting the very reef that supports the fishes that those fishers are after. So blast fishing is not the problem. It's the symptom of a larger problem. The symptom indicates you have a lot of desperately poor people trying to survive. And as they grow more desperate, they drop out of school to help in the fishing in the villages around our marine station. In the past, the children of fishers would get to grade 3, but recently the principal of a coastal grade school pointed out nowadays you would be lucky to see the children of fishers get to grade 1. The next image will be disturbing for many of you, so you may want to close your eyes for a few seconds. I want to show you an image taken in southern Luzon, and this is how desperate some fishers can get. They see this animal as competition for the fish that they are after. Look at what they did. They wired the mouth shut. They slashed the gut open. They gouge out the eyes, and they throw back the animal to the sea to drown. Really desperate people. Which brings us closer to where many of you are. Let's talk about Dumaguete. This is an image, satellite image, showing in red where the corals are along the shores of the city. Yes, the city is lined by reefs. And apparently, as these images show, taken this year, those reefs still have a lot of coral. Definitely more than the 10% needed to keep those reefs growing. And this project being discussed is going to bury those reefs. What will not get buried will be silted and choked to death. What does not choke to death gets contaminated by all the substances in the sediments that are used to build these artificial islands and liberated by the process that is used to produce these islands. I don't think that's a good idea. I work in De La Salle University, which is about here. And we are within walking distance of probably the largest reclaimed areas in the country. And when I read about the project being discussed in Dumaguete, I wonder if you are ready for what is likely to come should that project proceed as planned. Let me tell you about this place. So I've been working here for almost 25 years. Walking distance to all these places. These are the reclaimed areas. These are the communities that used to be coastal. Now you have blocks and blocks of blighted communities that used to be coastal. If you look closely, there's also a moat that separates the reclaimed area from the natural land. And when you get the sea breeze here, the sea breeze literally stinks because that moat is essentially a cesspool that traps all the material that comes out of the city that treats only about 10% of its sewage. And that sea breeze not only stinks, it's also very warm because before the sea breeze gets to you, it has gone over hectares of concrete, very good at trapping heat during the daytime. The temperature changes, the air quality changes, it is much noisier, the smell is unbearable, the noise is deafening. And this is the last place you want to be in at night. That's what you call development. Okay, so what do these things all mean for Dumaguete? Remember that reefs do not grow back. The reefs are not repairable. They are not repairable. The technology, as you will learn tomorrow, does not exist yet to fix a reef. You introducing a few corals or a few hundred corals or a few thousand corals does not give you a reef unless you keep doing that for about 10,000 years. Damaged reefs means the ecosystem services that reefs provide to our communities will not be there anymore. And I am quite familiar with Dumaguete. My father's favorite sister and her family is in Dumaguete. I love your city. You have an urban area with a small town feel. It's quiet at night. It's safe and peaceful. You're giving that up for development. The air will deteriorate, the water quality, your food will come from farther and farther places because what you do to your reef in front will affect the reefs in the adjacent towns to the south, to Tanyon Strait in the north, and your food will be contaminated. And finally, this invisible sector, the poorest of the poor, the ones who will not benefit from that so-called development. They will be more desperate, and that will change the situation drastically. So, thank you for allowing me to share the results of our work and some of my musings about what is in store for our city. Thanks to my colleagues in Siliman and the organizers of this forum, the Rotary Club and the Lions Club, and of course, members of my team, past and present, that allowed the sort of research presented in this work. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for sharing your valuable knowledge with us, Dr. Al. And perhaps for the evening, and before we go to the questions, we have quite a number that have come in over the span of your talk. I like how you said that things are not hopeless, but we need to consider the things about to come. And if we are here in Dumaguete ready for our environment to change, wherein we need to reconsider our quality of life. And I think we all share what you have experienced, no? Even if it seems like this is something that is quite normal to us. And I think this is where a lot of people are coming from, because apart from change being introduced, there's a lot of questions. And this is probably where the Dumaguete Host Lions Club and the Rotary Club are coming from. They are hosting this series of events basically for us to be able to expand our minds, knowing that the Dumaguete that we love is, well, for lack of a better term, threatened. And thank you for highlighting, sir, how the behavior of people, and especially those that are highly marginalized, could be changed, not for the best, which is something that we have been hearing quite a lot on, things that we might need to consider on the behavior of people, especially those who will lose in this scenario. Sir, with that, perhaps we can start with uh, answering the questions that have been sent to this webinar. In one of your slides, you showed an image of the Dumaguete coastline, which has turned quite controversial of late, because at the start, there were some claims, or there's a claim actually that was aired on national television. And the question of the attendee goes, um, Dumaguete definitely has those large, slow-growing corals, just like what you showed. And contrary to the claims by the mayor that there are no corals in our waters, can those large corals be really relocated given their massive size? And would you recommend transplanting these corals?
Okay. Thank you for that question. Yes, that photo of that massive coral caught my eye, because if you have corals as large as that, you're talking about really, really old corals, given how slowly they grow. And that means the area was or is conducive to coral growth for a few hundred years. Okay. Otherwise, you wouldn't get corals that large. Unfortunately, because they are so large and so heavy, they cannot be relocated very easily. You will need heavy equipment. You will need a barge. Uh, um, Several years ago, we worked with a power plant, and with a permit from the government, the Bureau of Fisheries, we were allowed to relocate about 3,000 corals, because the corals were in the way of a pipeline, uh, and that pipeline was needed to expand a power plant, because there's a need to expand generating capacity in the country. So the construction was allowed by the government, and we were allowed to relocate about 3,000 corals. That effort took uh, about 3 dozen people diving for about 2 to 3 weeks. And we were talking about an area that was just a few hundred square meters. That tells you you cannot relocate the corals in a reef. And we had the most trouble with the largest corals, and the fragile forms, because they do not detach easily. And so we actually still had to abandon the bases of many corals. The answer is no. If you want good case studies, you don't have to look at Jamaica. We should ignore things that we learn from Caribbean reefs, because Caribbean reefs are very different from Indo-Pacific reefs. In the whole of the Caribbean, where Jamaica is, they only have around 50 species of coral. We have in a typical reef 100 to 200 species of coral. A reef in Pangasinan with 12% coral cover had more than 105 species of coral. So that's why I say stop listening to all these videos from Florida and so on. The Caribbean reefs are very different. Look at what they tried to do in Singapore. They had to expand 2 or 3 islands so that they can have more processing capability for petrochemicals, refineries essentially. They tried to move the corals, but the costs were simply too high. Relocating the corals on the reef is one thing, but the thousands of years of growth they are building on, you don't relocate that. Okay.
So I think, sir, because there's this how do you call it, this acronym that's being introduced because of this and the issue on corals. I think this next question is quite related. Somebody is asking, sir, would it be possible to integrate the reefs into the design of these proposed islands?
Uh, Short answer, no.
Okay.
Explanation. One of the things I learned working with civil engineers, I got to meet a group of civil engineers who worked for a mining company, and the government advised them to build a wharf on pilings so that they don't have to damage the reef, to build a port so that they can transfer their ores to ships. And so we spent half a day discussing the options to try and avoid damaging a reef in the path of their construction activity. And they were very attentive, well-meaning. But in the end, what I learned from that experience is any construction that involves less than 5 to 3 meters of depth. Okay. The initial stages of any construction piles so that a port or an island, then 3 meters involves building that's a pile so that the construction equipment can go to the places where they're supposed to build these sustainable structures. A reef with any development starts by killing the reef. And so by then, there's nothing to save. That's the reason for the no. You don't integrate.
So it's a definite no, sir. It's impossible. In your
Definite no.
definite
The
no.
technology does not exist.
Okay, thank you for sharing that with us, sir. I think yeah, this is something that has been thrown around, and although yeah, because of lack of expert or scientific data that's available, it seems to be something that lessens the impact no, of the concern, or is trying to lessen the impact of the concern. And I'm glad that for those who are attending the meeting right now and those who are watching through Facebook, we can have something to talk about again after tonight. I think also based or related to that, sir, someone is asking, you pointed out that coral reefs in the Philippines have suffered a large decline in coral cover in the past 40 years. What is the government policy? And I think this is something very timely with what was just posted on Rappler a while ago. What is the government policy that is set to help these reefs recover? I think this was something that was asked a while ago. Is it something that involves coral relocation?
Well, our main response to the decline of marine life of our seas in general is to protect areas, valuable areas from further exploitation or damage. Okay, so local and national governments set up marine protected areas, that sort of thing, which in theory allows for natural regeneration. But that is a realistic expectation only if these protected areas are managed well and are large enough so that they can sustain themselves. Uh, as I said earlier, relocating corals essentially just allows you at best to save the living layer of the reef. But that means leaving behind the generations of coral skeleton and the accumulation of that material that is the reef that serves as their home. And like I said earlier, you don't relocate that. And so moving them around is not a realistic option because the living generation is one thing, but if you wound a reef, and this is work, uh, research, the outcome of research done in places like Silliman. For example, one reason blast fishing is so destructive is because it peels off this living layer of the reef. Okay, essentially the skin of the reef, which exposes the material under that living layer. And when you have that hemorrhage of these sediments trapped under the living coral, those sediments prevent the settlement of baby corals because, as I pointed out, the corals do not like sediments. They do not grow very well on sand. Okay. So you, by doing something to the living layer in an effort to save it, you're actually just accelerating the death of that system. Okay, that's why I made the big deal about there's coral and there's a coral reef, and one builds the other, but you don't want to mix up those two things.
Thank you for that answer, sir. So I think also this could be quite related when an attendee is asking, based on your definition, there are definitely some well-developed coral reefs in Dumaguete with a reef flat of more than 50 meters wide. And you also said that such well-developed reefs take thousands of years to develop. Do you think damaging such coral reefs should be avoided at all costs simply because they are so old?
Yes, yes. The answer is a definite yes. When we finally published our outputs for the nationwide assessment, we pointed out that there's this recurring pattern that the reef areas that have the most coral and the most diversity of coral are usually the same reef areas that are well developed. And so, as I pointed out earlier, if you have really big, really old corals and you have well-developed reefs, that means you have a system that is in an area that is conducive to coral growth for a very long time period. And and for the fossil reefs I showed earlier, I was showing you essentially what happened 10,000 years ago when we had a warming episode. Okay, and the corals that lived 10,000 years ago, during this warming episode, are the same species we find in our reefs. Okay. So those reefs, those corals, the species have endured climate change. And so, what does that mean? Your best bet for the reefs that will survive future climate change, if they can survive climate change, your best bet are the well-developed reefs. So if you have a well-developed reef, that should be your priority in terms of conservation. These places where you have coral growing on rocks, they do support a lot of diversity. But like I said, nationally, our finding is the older, well-developed reefs support more coral and more variety of coral.
So I think, sir, since we are talking about the development and growth of corals, one attendee is actually asking, as Dumaguete residents, and knowing now definitely that our reefs are alive and growing, is there anything as members of the community that we can do so that we can hasten the growth, if we can do that, or promote conservation of these reefs? I think what he is saying is, if there's anything that we as a community can do.
The best thing you can do for the reef is to leave it alone. Let it be in the sense that you try and control the factors, the stressors that damage the reef. Do something about sedimentation. Do something about trampling or anchoring. Do something about sewage getting to those reefs. And if you take care of those stressors, the ones that come from human activity, you can let the reef take care of itself, because it can, but not if the natural stressors are overlain with a thicker layer of human-derived stressors.
So it's basically...
I should add, if I may, there's places na they tell you you want to help the reef. Okay, let's do some coral gardening. Terrible idea. You create more damage than good. But best you ask the next presenter, Lori, tomorrow night about that.
Thank you for sharing that. So it's really basically doing our part in the area or the land area, being more aware of our behavior, not doing some... It's not more of an active thing towards the corals. Am I right, sir? It's being more aware of our human...
Yes. 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 A lot of damage is caused by well-meaning people who are not guided by science.
True.
Good intentions are not enough.
Thank you for highlighting that for us, sir. Because that's right. A lot of people have that as intentions, and I think that's what you meant when people said, "Let's do coral gardening." and thank you for really clarifying that corals are animals. So we take care of them by changing or by being more aware of our behavior. Speaking about corals, or rather doing something in the area of the sea, somebody's asking if, as far as sustaining fish and other marine life, aside from corals, how do artificial reefs compare to natural coral reefs?
Short answer, they don't. in fact, in the scientific literature, they stopped calling them artificial reefs because if you compare a concrete block, few meters, a meter across, that's nothing compared to several thousand square kilometers of coral reef that's several meters thick. We got involved in an artificial habitat project in Batangas, funded by government. And you'll be surprised how much artificial habitat, 3 million pesos, can build. Drop in a bucket. Artificial structures serve a function, but they cannot replace reefs simply because they're not large enough. So there's a scale difference. So no, you cannot build a reef out of concrete. That's as good as throwing money into the water.
Okay. So I'll be subbing
Angie got cut
for a
off.
bit. So there's a question over here that's a little bit sobering. It says the trajectory of coral cover is plummeting, as you have mentioned, and it's only a matter of time before that reclamation project could be done without damaging marine life. Would this be an accurate statement? So
if I understand that question correctly, if you wait long enough, there's nothing left to damage. Is I guess what the question meant. Well, if you can foretell the future well enough, you can base your decisions on that. But what if you're wrong? What if that reef can survive climate change? If the damage, if you are wrong, is not something you can reverse. So best course of action is to try to save what's there, because if you believe na it will go back, or it's hopeless anyway, parang walang point. Yeah, that's my understanding of the question. I'm not sure if I'm answering it correctly.
I do think that's what this asker was talking about. So there's another one here. We'll go on. Now this seems like a question by somebody who knows what he's talking about. So we'll see. It says here, besides bleaching due to high SST, has eutrophication and land use changes played a role in the increase in macroalgae? Has there been studies on changes in water quality over time with remote sensing imagery?
I'm not familiar with the use of remote sensing for judging water quality, other than the the use of images in quantifying chlorophyll. But there's a lot of local studies, recent studies on eutrophication, very interesting ones. For example, work in Manila Bay, mainly by UPMSI, showing large parts of Manila Bay receive so much organic matter from two rivers that for many months in the year, large areas at certain depths actually run out of oxygen. Okay, which is why I said one reason Manila Bay literally stinks. Okay. There's so much organic matter that they run out of oxygen. There's also some very interesting work, the results of studies on the impact of all the excess feeds from mariculture, the bangus pens in the Bolinao-Anda reef system. So even without remote sensing technology, you'll find some very interesting case studies in those two places. We're in the process of trying to get some work published, monitoring data from a reef in Palawan, a reef system in Palawan, 9 years of monitoring data. And another factor that leads to the shift in algae is overfishing. And so what happens, and that's what we're finding, if you have bleaching killing off the corals, the reefs that recover faster are the reefs that have less macroalgae. If the algal growth overtakes coral growth, the reef may never recover or recover at about 1/5 the rate of a reef that is managed well enough. Now, there's enough fish to keep the algae in control. Which brings me back to the things I've been saying earlier. You control the pollutants, you control the things that come from people to begin with, and the reef can take care of itself after that.
My apologies for that technical mishap, sir. Thank you,
No problem.
Mr. IT, for quickly taking over. Should I just let you take over instead? No, just kidding. Sir, I'm just gonna go on asking, sir, since you were talking about global warming, I think I caught you answering a question that had something to do with the warming of the waters. Someone's also curious, if a coral reef suffers bleaching due to global warming, would you consider that reef already dead? And should we just give up on these reefs and allow a massive reclamation project just in case?
Again, short answer, no. I showed images of the temperature anomalies of 2020 for good reason. As you probably know, 2020 ties with 2016, I believe, as the warmest year on record. So we had bleaching last year all around the country, except the scientists were stuck in their homes and not able to assess the damage caused by bleaching. But in I think the June issue of the Philippine Journal of Science, we have a research note there because we've been pushing citizen science in our coastal communities, empowering our local fishers, for example, to monitor their reefs on their own. And one such team was able to go out twice last year in Batangas, Western Batangas. They showed that by July of last year, up to 42% of the corals were bleached in July. When they visited those same reefs in October of last year, they found almost all the coral that bleached recovered. Okay, so this is the warmest year on record. This is a reef that's under sedimentation stress. Very easy to give up on those reefs, but they recovered in a matter of months. Why? Maybe because there's not a lot of human activity during the pandemic. Anthropos, nature got a break, and those reefs recovered. So too early to give up on the reefs.
Thank you for sharing that story with us, sir. And I think there's a lot of things that we also might need to pay attention to as citizens or as community members as well. And it's always like we always try to look around the environment, and often we forget our role in the whole cycle of or in the chain of the ecosystem. Often we try to see ourselves as very active doers all the time. And yes, sometimes we forget that just letting the things around us be is also very important so that we get what we need actually. Oh, there's one other interesting, we were comparing things a while ago. This attendee is asking if there's a way to compare the importance or how important are seagrass beds compared to coral reefs.
That's a kind of an unfair comparison because they do different things. One of the slides that I had to remove from my presentation because it was already too long is a slide that shows how the seagrass, the mangrove, and the corals in a reef interact. But basically the gist of the story is if you have healthy mangrove, seagrass, and coral adjacent to each other, you get more fish. Because the corals in the reef prevent the strong waves from damaging the seagrass and the mangrove. The seagrass and the mangrove help bind the sediments, slow down the erosion of the coastline, and essentially hold down the sediments that will damage the coral. So they form part of an ecosystem. You don't get one without the other. So there's this interesting anecdote from Eastern Batangas. Our resort had guests complaining about the seagrass because makate. And so hindi nila mapuntahan yung reef kasi they have to swim through the seagrass. And so low tide, they got the tractor and peeled off the seagrass bed. And then in a matter of months, the people were asking, why is the reef dying? It was dying because the seagrass bed was damaged.
Thank you for sharing that with us, sir. No? And that's right. I think more than ever, a lot of us have become more curious and appreciative of the things that we used to, like probably those people used to annoy us when we went to resorts and all that. I personally am probably one of those, and who has, I would say I have a new and renewed appreciation for seagrass now. I love seagrass now. Someone is also asking, sir, about marine protected area. So I think we have been talking about this of late. In the Dumaguete coastline, there are 4 that are identified. And the attendee is asking with those 4 MPAs that will be directly impacted by the reclamation, what are in the DNR policy that would be violated, if there are any?
I'm not the best person to answer questions about regulation. The reason I hesitate answering that question is because there are a lot of loopholes with regards to what local government can do, what national government can do, what certain agencies can do, what others cannot do. And it's that very complicated landscape that confuses me, and that means likely what I will tell you is not going to be very useful. So I'd rather not answer that question. Sorry.
Thank you for your honesty, sir. But yeah, probably a little bit closer to that. Maybe you can answer this. With all the efforts done by the government, non-government organizations, and other environmental partners, what for you would be considered as the best practice to address the problem of the fast deteriorating status of our coral reef system? Something or a practice that can be implemented all throughout the country, sir.
One of the things we pointed out when we wrote up the results of the nationwide assessment is to point out that the last nationwide assessment was done 40 years ago. And in that time, especially the last 10 years, we lost a lot of coral, and we hardly noticed that loss. Okay. So assessments only tell you what we have lost. Okay. And that's not very useful because it's past tense. You know?
Mm-hmm.
If you monitor a reef, however, you're able to see warning signs that something is amiss. You're able to see that some of the things you are doing are not helping or are even creating more damage. And so monitoring allows us to take care of our reefs better. And the best kind of monitoring is the monitoring that's done by the people living near around those reefs. That's our argument for citizen science monitoring of reefs. Citizen science will allow more people to see what's going on. Citizen science will allow people to gain a better understanding of how reefs work, what damages them, what helps them. Citizen science allows us to manage the reefs better. So earlier I made a comment, good intentions are not enough because good intentions can kill a lot of corals.
That's right.
You don't know what you're doing.
Yes.
Please put your energy in citizen science. Help us monitor our reefs. Help us find out what's going on. And help us tell the others what's going on.
Somebody's actually asking if there is something that they can do. And I think you've already answered that this question, if there's any way for us to help make inventory of our reefs. I think that would answer this question. Am I right?
Yeah.
Promote citizen science.
Yeah. Like we did this in the past, and we're gearing up to do it again, and hopefully at better scale. we can teach you how to recognize endangered species of coral in one evening's lecture. And if you go around the country diving, and if you know how to recognize those species, we can quickly put together a map of where these endangered species are. And that is going to be really valuable because the presence of endangered species will clearly be an important consideration for any so-called development projects.
So I guess this is something for, especially for those who have an interest in the sea or the dive enthusiasts, and they're very interested in how they can help. So I think we can.
Photographers.
Yes. So there you go. So for those who are attending here or watching through Facebook Live, you heard Doc Al, and we can probably work with our scientists in the area. There are a lot. And you can get in touch with them to do that. Yeah. There's also another one interested in knowing, sir, if there is, or there are other methods, or are there other methods that can be done for coral regrowth aside from coral restoration? That's the question. Are there other methods that can be done for coral regrowth aside from restoration?
Besides leaving the reef alone and controlling the stressors, I think that's pretty much an easy answer, but of course very difficult to do, because something that's often forgotten in these discussions and something that everybody should consider. We're dealing with a medium, the sea, seawater, that's 830 times denser than air, which means things can get carried really far in the sea. And so you damage the reefs in Dumaguete, that's essentially going to damage the coastal areas of adjacent towns and provinces.
Yeah, so there's a lot of,
and vice versa.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about that actually right now, how the interconnectivity, especially because of the presence of the ocean, is going to how it's gonna pan out, or how it's gonna be for the adjoining or the adjacent municipalities and all that. So hopefully this could be another way of starting conversations about that, especially with our neighboring towns. And sir, there's also someone who's asking about, because when going back to the reclamation project, when this was introduced, one of the things that was highlighted was a water treatment facility, supposedly to, help control the pollution or the condition of the waters per se. And that attendee is curious if this is something that is good for the coral reefs, having that in that reclaimed island.
On paper, yes. Reality is, and as I tried to show in one slide, the process of constructing those artificial islands will introduce so much material into the sea that to build a treatment plant after the fact is kind of futile. And I don't know about sewage treatment plants, but you have to get the sewage to those treatment plants. And if you really want to treat sewage, you have to essentially redo the plumbing of an entire city. And that is no easy feat. And that's why Manila Bay still stinks. Because we cannot build treatment plants fast enough, and we cannot get the sewage to those treatment plants, even if they were built. So we're still stuck with septic tanks that have to be drained. And a lot of people don't even realize that septic tanks do fill up, and you have to dispose of the contents properly. Okay, so it's very easy to enumerate, this will take care of that, this will take care of that, this will take care of that. But like corals and coral reefs and all these things about restoration, the question is scale and timing.
Since you mentioned about Manila Bay, sir, someone's actually also curious if you have done research on the marine life in the Manila Bay area, and if you can compare it, how does it differ to the coastal Dumaguete marine life?
Manila Bay is very different because it's mostly estuarine, so mixing of freshwater and saltwater. That means how salty the sea is changes, and corals do not like salinity changes. And so large parts of Manila Bay likely didn't have coral reefs, or the reefs in Manila Bay are probably the first ones that we lost in this country. So no, I don't have a lot of work in Manila Bay. In my first year in Salle, I had a thesis student working in Cavite. We were studying things that grow on pier piles. And every time we go into Manila Bay, as soon as we go out, we essentially take a bath in alcohol because it's as good as swimming in a cesspool. Horrible waters.
I can't
and this
even
was more
imagine.
than 20 years ago.
So it's not like comparing apples to bananas.
Yes, because you have, and that's why you have reefs. You have well flushed waters. You have strong currents moving through those waters. And those waters have strong currents. And corals love that. And so your systems are very different from Manila Bay's. But those strong currents also tell you that if your neighboring towns and cities don't take care of their coastal areas as well, then any management in one area will be negated by mistakes made in others.
So I think it's something that we also need to reconsider in terms of probably how we need to work together as part of this whole system. And with that, sir, I think someone is curious about how you would react to how our mayor has been saying that it is possible to avoid or integrate corals into a reclamation project. What is your reaction to that thought, sir?
Impossible. Mixing oil and water. Like I described earlier, modern construction techniques are unfortunately very damaging to water quality and consequently anything in those waters. And like I also mentioned earlier, all you need to do is talk to marine scientists in Singapore, and they have very good ones studying their reefs, and one way to sum it up is a lot of them are sad because they know what used to be there, and they know what's not there anymore. So you're talking about better developed economies failing at integrating development with their own reefs. The farther you get from Singapore, the better the reefs are. That's essentially the gist of what their studies show.
And that's an interesting way of looking at it, because Singapore has actually been given, or has been the stories about Singapore is one of the things that's been told over and again when it comes to this project, sir. So with that, Dr. Al, we'd like to thank you so much for sharing your time with us, your invaluable time with us. But before we go, sir, is there anything that you'd like to leave us with for tonight, perhaps for us to think about before we wind our day down?
Yes, I kind of alluded to this earlier. These big projects get a lot of attention, and they should. But like I also said earlier, imagine all towns along that coastline of Negros do small scale reclamations for port development, to have a small commercial area or something. A lot of small projects like that are as damaging as one big project. So we have to match the solution to the scale of the problem. And this is a national problem. We might win some battles, but if we make the mistake of thinking one battle is enough to win a war, we're making a big mistake.
Thank you for those words, sir. That's right. When we are too nearsighted about things, we often forget that, especially with our situation, we have the whole ocean to consider, and that links us all together. And that's very, very nice coming from you, sir, telling us that this is not just a battle that we need to worry about. It is essentially a national one. Thank you so much, Dr. Al, for sharing with us your insights and your knowledge. We are very, very lucky and blessed to have you with us tonight. And there you have it, everyone. This is version 8, or our learning event series 8.0. On behalf of the Dumaguete City Host Lions Club and Rotary Club of Dumaguete South, we thank you for joining us. Tonight, we close with a lot of thoughts, probably a lot of new information, and I encourage everyone to think about them, think about our roles as members of the community, and think about also how our behaviors in itself have great impact on the world around us, not just our fellow people, but also even the corals that we do not see, because there's a lot of misinformation going on, and a lot of things that Dr. Al has shared with us tonight will essentially answer those and allow us to correct misinformation that's going around as well. So with that, I'd like to also make some announcements. Tomorrow evening at the same time, Dr. Lori Raimundo will be sharing with us what we have been probably most curious about on coral reef restoration. Kindly follow and like our Facebook page, Learning Event Series, and be updated on upcoming events. This won't be the last. There will be recordings of the sessions on Zoom, and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. The links will be made available on the page. And if there are any questions that you'd like to ask in advance for the next learning events that will happen, you may message directly through the Facebook page that is available. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. Good night.